Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Jackson Pugh. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University, and this is my final presentation in my course, Emergency Management and Crisis Communication. This presentation will go over two survival incidences and compare them to the principles we have learned in this course. Those principles include emergency management, leadership, strategic platform, and a communication plan. So, to begin with, I will analyze the Donner Party, and then I will push forward into the Andes flight disaster. The Donner Party occurred in the 1840s, and this involved migrants coming from the east to the west coast. These migrants were led by a man named George Donner. One of the biggest failures on George Donner's leadership part occurred whenever he made the strategic decision to journey off path into a new route that was supposed to shave more than 2 weeks off of this already harsh and treacherous journey. In actuality, this new shortcut added more than 100 miles to their journey to the west coast. After this decision, many hardships endured along the way. One of the biggest problems that occurred was when an axle to one of the wagons broke high in the Sierra Mountains, and the group had to make camp for the night. So that night, more than 5 feet of snow fell and caused the group to be snowed in for several months. This group was already scarce on supplies whenever this situation endured. And a way that they survived is they resorted to eating twigs, berries, dirt, and eventually resorted to consuming their dead, cannibalism. So the end result of this scenario is a couple of the migrants eventually had to make the harsh and long journey in the snow from their location in the Sierra Nevada mountains to Sacramento to try and find rescue personnel. After 3 agonizing weeks, these migrants eventually made it and told the location of the rest of the group. And the rescue personnel sought out to get the rest of the group in the winter time. But the rescue personnel lacked the necessary survival supplies themselves, and eventually a few of the rescue personnel ended up succumbing to starvation, and they themselves had to resort to cannibalism. It wasn't until late April 1847, I believe, that the rest of the migrants eventually made it to safety in the west coast after many had perished. So, moving on, we'll analyze the Andes flight disaster. The Andes flight disaster occurred in 1972. This disaster involved a Uruguayan rugby team that was traveling from Uruguay to Chile for a rugby match. Later discovered by investigators, the altitude meter on board the aircraft had malfunctioned. This possibly caused the aircraft to crash into the snowy mountaintop. Once the plane had crashed and the survivors had come to, the survivors realized that the rear compartment of the aircraft was completely missing, was completely gone, nowhere in sight. The leader of this scenario was the team captain of the rugby team, he assumed the leadership role. It was his decision to shelter in place in the forward part of the aircraft, get as much supplies as they could, and ration it until they could be rescued by rescue personnel. This decision ultimately caused this decision of sheltering in place and rationing the supplies ultimately cost a few people their life whenever a avalanche fell on top of the place where they were making camp inside the forward part of the aircraft. Many hardships endured along the way. Eventually, a few of the survivors had no other choice but to walk off the mountain and try and find a village and relay information to where the rest of the group was to get the rest of the party, the rest of the group rescued. So moving on to the principles and the shortcomings in both of these survival scenarios, I believe it is, I will begin with the Donner Party. I believe the biggest leadership and strategic failure would have to involve George Donner. I believe it was his decision to go on the new route. This new route caused a chain of events that led to the survival incident. And it was also his decision not to stock up on supplies in case the Donner Party was to get into trouble along the new route and were delayed. So I believe that was a leadership and strategic failure on his part. Regarding communication, I believe the biggest communication occurred when George Donner took the advice of a man named Hastings. Hastings was supposedly a journeyman experienced in getting migrants from the east to the west coast. Hastings was supposed to be the guide along the new route that supposedly was supposed to save the migrants' time. Hastings ends up getting lost along the new route. Hastings tells the Donner Party to shelter in place as he pushes forward and tries to figure out the new route. After 3 weeks of sheltering in place, Hastings sends back a messenger telling the Donner Party to find a new route, that this route is compromised. Anyways, George Donner, after losing necessary time and already losing necessary resources due to this delay, goes on a new undefined route that ultimately sends them in the direction of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And as previously stated, this going northwest and into the mountains and being that much closer to winter, caused the survival incident of which I illustrated earlier. So I believe that is one of the biggest communication and shortfalls that occurred during this event. If you would like to bring anything to my attention, I would like to discuss it further with you in the discussion post. Moving on to the Andes flight disaster regarding leadership strategies and communication, I believe one of the biggest leadership failures occurred before the aircraft even impacted the mountaintop. I believe this leadership failure occurred on the airline's part. Looking back on all of my previous flights, I have noticed that all of the necessary food and survival supplies is usually located in the rear compartments of the aircraft. Noted previously, the tail section of this aircraft was completely missing. I believe it would have been best on the airline's part to equally distribute all survival supplies throughout the aircraft. Most importantly, food. Placing food in strategic locations throughout the aircraft could have given these survivors more time. And also, I believe another leadership failure occurred on the team captain's part by deciding to have all participants in the survival scenario shelter in place. In my opinion, the end result was the same. The survivors ended up having to basically rescue themselves. They had to walk down the mountain, find civilization, relay information, and give the location of where the rest of the group were. I believe this leadership failure occurred at the beginning of the survival event. In my opinion, I would have taken the wounded, I would have had them shelter in place inside the aircraft, and I would have taken the strongest survivors of the initial aircraft and given them the necessary resources for a few days survival to try and find civilization. And I would have gone from there. The end result was the same, but only now, after months of agonizing survival on top of the mountain, did they come to the conclusion that they needed to walk off the mountain and try and find civilization. Only this time, the survivors were already malnourished, and they limited their chances for survival right then. Regarding communication in this event, their communication plan was a little bit limited. They did manage to salvage a radio from the wreckage, but it had receiving capabilities and did not have transmitting capabilities. One of their communication plans that I thought was pretty cool was they decided to take their empty luggage and place it outside the aircraft and in a giant SOS symbol on top of the snowy mountaintop, in hopes to have other aircraft flying ahead to see their location and relay the location to rescue personnel. I believe this decision and the communication plan was a great form of thinking outside the box on the survival of the rugby team on top of that mountain. Now, this case comparison between these two events, as it pertains to leadership, strategic platform, and communication plan. In conclusion, I believe the survivors of these horrific events did the best they could with the hands they were dealt. There were definitely shortcomings in regards to leadership and strategies and communication. But all in all, I don't see much of any alternatives as to how they could have handled the events much better. If you have an opinion on the shortcomings of these events, I would like to hear them in the discussion post, and I look forward to communication with you this following week. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.